All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for this week's COE seminar series, which is going to be a talk or host a talk by Kirsty Nash. And Georgie is going to introduce Kirsty in a moment, but we'll do the normal 45-minute talk and then ask questions at the end, and we'll allow you to unmute yourself. So if you can save your questions until the end and then give them to Kirsty then, that would be great. So without any more conversation, Georgie, would you like to introduce Kirsty?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So today we're really lucky to have Kirsty Nash here to talk to us about her research on pursuing sustainability for the world's oceans. So Kirsty is based in Tasmania at the Centre for Marine Socioecology, where she's a leader of the Sustainable Futures and Planetary Health program. But prior to moving south, she spent many years living in Townsville, where she undertook a master's and a PhD, where she was supervised primarily by Nick Graham, now in Lancaster. And she also worked as a postdoc for a year on spatial ecology of reef fishes. So with her move south, Kirsty's research has focused increasingly on how to achieve ocean sustainability, and in looking holistically at that in terms of achieving the social, economic and environmental pillars or components of sustainability. But before we hear more about this exciting research that she's been doing over the last few years, I just also like to point to Kirsty's initiative, Academic Life, which is a really valuable website with a bunch of resources for those balancing a career in academia and parental and caring work. And last year, Kirsty was awarded an Inspiring Science Award from Nature Journal's organisation for her research and for her Academic Life initiative. So thanks very much, Kirsty, and take it away.
Thank you, Georgie, and thank you, Brock. So as Georgie has mentioned, I'm going to be talking about sustainability on a blue planet. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk today, and I hope that everyone is doing well in lockdown. So the talk today, I'm going to talk about a couple of research projects that I've been working on. One looking at the oceans and the Sustainable Development Goals, another that has been inspired by the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and also just talking a little bit about my move towards more interdisciplinary research and some of the lessons that I've learned from doing that. So, as I mentioned, I've become increasingly interested in interdisciplinary research and building on my marine ecology background. And just to give you sort of an overview of where I've come from and where I'm heading, at JCU, my PhD and postdoc were focused on coral reef resilience, particularly looking at the spatial ecology of reef fish and herbivores in particular. And then moving from that, I started to be more interested in resilience of social ecological systems more holistically, and particularly in small scale fisheries and ecological indicators of fisheries on coral reefs. And then more recently, I've been increasingly focused on sustainability and the feedbacks between ocean health and human health. And this is a range of different aspects, from human nutrition through to mental health and the oceans. And so this work has become increasingly interdisciplinary, but I think I wanted to emphasize that there's been a common thread through all of these, which isn't necessarily apparent immediately, but functional ecology has really been my focus and my contribution to the work, even as it's become more interdisciplinary. So the first research project I wanted to talk about was looking at progress assessments towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and using the oceans as a case study of that. So the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, composed of 169 different targets, they were designed to account for the three pillars of sustainability: the biosphere, the economy, and society. And they were also designed to account for some of the interactions. So within goals, there are elements of the biosphere, economy and society. And this is really important because to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and minimise undesirable outcomes of efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we really need to understand and account for these interactions amongst these three pillars. And as a result, there's been an increasing amount of literature on synergies and trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goals. So this one in the bottom right-hand corner is an example from Singh et al., where they looked at the synergies and trade-offs between the different targets within SDG 14, life below water, and all the other SDGs. And just went through and looked at what were the targets of SDG 14 that were prerequisites for some of these other SDGs, what were trade-offs, and which were not connected at all. So that's all to do with the design of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we think about them. But then there's a whole separate section which is to do with progress assessment. So how are we assessing whether we're actually meeting these Sustainable Development Goals? And these progress assessments, they come in various forms, but they're based on indicators. And this is just an example from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where they've put together a dashboard. This is for countries in East and South Asia. And for each of the goals, they've used indicators to rate the countries from grey, which means they don't have enough data, red, where they're definitely not going to meet the goal by 2030, through to green, where they're on track and looking good. And so these sorts of progress assessments are reliant on one to maybe a few, so sort of 2 or 3 indicators to assess whether we are going to achieve each of those targets or goals. And that's all very well for some of the targets and goals. So for example, if we look at target 3.1, which is by 2030, reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 live births. Having an individual indicator that looks at the maternal mortality ratio and the proportion of births attended by skilled health personnel makes perfect sense. So it's a fairly easy thing to measure. But you have other targets that are a little bit more complex. So this is target 5A, which is to undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and natural resources in accordance with national laws. But if you look at the indicator that's used to assess whether that target is being met, it's very much focused on agriculture, and there's absolutely no mention of fisheries at all. So obviously, in some instances, using these individual 1 or 2 indicators, you're actually you're not getting the full picture of whether what is intended by these targets is actually being met. In addition to that, the indicators don't really account for these synergies and trade-offs that have been built into the design of the SDGs. And what I was interested in was what were the implications of this kind of compartmentalized approach to the indicators for long-term sustainability outcomes. And to do that, I used the oceans as a case study. And the reason I focused on the oceans, other than the fact that that's what I know, is because there's significant challenges with our capacity to meet SDG 14, life below water. And that's everything from monitoring challenges, even stock assessments. There's a lot of discussion, even in developed countries with lots of money and resources, about the status of stocks. So we have considerable monitoring challenges. There's also, the oceans present a moving target. And so understanding whether we are going to achieve the goal when we don't really know what the situation is right now is obviously very taxing, very difficult. Also, there's been very low prioritization of the oceans within the SDGs. So this plot here by Custer et al., they interviewed government decision makers, sustainability practitioners and NGOs around the world to ask them to prioritize the goals in order of importance. And pretty much across the board, goal 14 came out as the lowest priority. and with that lowest priority, lowest funding. Now that's not necessarily a problem if we're doing very well towards goal 14, but if you look at the submissions that have been made to the high-level political forum on progress towards the SDGs, we can see that only 2% of countries are likely to meet goal 14 by 2030. And if we look at the individual targets, none of them are going to be convincingly met. Some of them we're sort of uncertain about, we might meet them, and a number of them we're not going to meet. So we really have a very low chance of meeting goal 14 by 2030. So the oceans represent a really concerning aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got these challenges to meet SDG 14 and low prioritization, but also at the same time, we've got this massive enthusiasm for developing the blue economy. Currently, it's about equivalent to the 7th largest economy in the world, and it's doubling in size every decade. But at the same time, the concept of the blue economy is quite contested. Some people are very much focused on business development and extracting resources, whereas for others, it's more about livelihoods and conservation and natural capital. So this is really reflective of the different framings that come up in sustainability. And so the oceans provide a great case study to look at some of these implications of the way the progress assessments are currently set up. So what are the implications? We have these progress assessments that compartmentalize the goals, and we have a low probability of meeting goal 14. But does that really matter beyond goal 14? Does it matter for the other goals? And I'm just going to talk through an example that looks at interactions between life below water and goal number 1, which is no poverty. And I definitely would like to acknowledge here that I am aware that there's many dimensions of poverty. And so eradicating poverty obviously is a multidimensional task. But what I'm going to be focused on is government-funded initiatives of reducing poverty. So on this plot, just to quickly go through, explain it, on the x-axis, we have SDG 1, which is ending poverty, and these are indicator assessments that have been used to assess various different small island nations from countries where we don't have any data. So that's the left-hand column through to the right-hand end of the x-axis, which is countries that have attained no poverty already. So that's the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have economic dependence on the oceans. And this is based on tourism and fisheries. So obviously there are other industries provided by the ocean, but because I was interested in industries that could potentially be impacted by the health of the environment specifically, this economic dependence is just focused on tourism and fisheries. And then the colours of the dots are progress towards SDG 14, life below water. So the dark blue is we're on track, through to the orange, which means these countries are stagnating and they're not going to achieve SDG 14. And what I wanted to look at is, so you have these indicators that show the data for SDG 14 and for SDG 1. If we look in the right-hand column for SDG 1, the countries that have already attained it, and we look at the orange dots, so the Bahamas and the Maldives, these are countries that on first look are actually doing very well as far as ending poverty. They've already attained it, they're on track. So in the short term, they're doing very well. But there are also countries that have high economic dependence on the oceans. So the Maldives, it's up here at sort of 80%. Bahamas, it's sort of around 50%. So in these instances, having a healthy ocean to support tourism and fisheries is really quite important. And if we want governments to provide poverty reduction initiatives, it really is reliant on a healthy economy. And that healthy economy is going to be in danger if you have countries that are so reliant on the oceans and yet they're not going to achieve SDG 14 and potentially with climate change, the situation is going to become even worse in the future. So we have this situation where we have some countries where there's a real risk that short-term gains in reducing poverty are actually masking long-term potential to have increased poverty in the future because of this interaction between life below water and no poverty, and the use of indicators that totally separate those things out. We also potentially miss opportunities. So here, for example, with Micronesia, currently they're doing pretty badly with regards to ending poverty. They're actually moving away from the goal. And they have actually quite low economic dependence on the oceans, but they're actually on track to meet life below water, to meet goal 14. So potentially here's a country that could start to place more dependence on their oceans and exploit the tourism and fisheries to a greater extent to help address some of these, to help improve the economy and potentially provide government-funded initiatives to reduce poverty. So the sort of take-home message from that is the risk and opportunities are not clear if we track the progress towards these goals in a compartmentalized approach. If we're only looking at achieving goal 1 or we're only looking at achieving goal 14, we don't necessarily understand how these short-term decisions can potentially block long-term sustainability. And just to give you an idea of how that can play out, the indicators I showed you previously for SDG 1, which is no poverty, shows about 56% of countries are likely to meet SDG 1 by 2030. So it's a pretty good outcome. But then if you look at other research that works on, has used expert elicitation and has really incorporated more of these interactions, it really states that progress towards SDG 1 is pretty poor. I think 60% of researchers they asked and experts they asked thought that progress towards SDG was very poor. So this reliance on indicators to show how the world is going and how we're tracking towards the SDGs is potentially quite problematic. There's also the potential of what's the scale of the issue. So I just talked through one example, but is this a problem on a broader scale? Well, the UN has stated that 34 of the 91 social and economic targets are directly reliant on the biosphere. So this isn't just an isolated issue where we look at the oceans and poverty, it's a broader issue. And also, this doesn't account for other indirect and mediating interactions. So just for example, life below water can have an impact on decent work. So say, for example, 14.5, target 14.5 is about protecting marine life through marine protected areas, which obviously has an impact on availability of fishing grounds. But there's also other mediating factors like gender equality and which genders are fishing where. So we put in a marine park that doesn't impact on male fishers that maybe fish offshore, but does affect reef gleaning. So there's a lot of these indirect interactions that we really need to account for when we're looking at these progress assessments. So what are the solutions to this? Well, obviously you can't make these assessments too onerous because then people won't do them. We do need to track how we are going towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and these indicator assessments have been put into place. So how can we potentially improve them? And I'm not going to go through all the detail here, but just to sort of give you a brief intro. The boxes at the top that are shaded in are different interactions between marine protected areas, fishing pressure, how that impacts on the coastal ecosystem, what impacts that might have on tourism and the fishery, and how that might impact human welfare in the long term. And if you look at the empty squares at the bottom, that just have the coloured lines around them, these are different indicators that are used or are already used in relation to these different components. Now, if we can come up with results chain. So that's a way of visualizing the relationships we think are going on between these different factors and laying them out in this sort of results chain theory of change process. We can then potentially link the indicators in indicator databases. And instead of looking at these indicators separately, we can start thinking, all right, okay, we know what the percentage of coastal marine zone designated as no take is, but we know that that is also linked to percentage of the catch from coastal fishery disaggregated by gender of fisher. And by linking these indicators, it gives us a way of getting at some of these interactions and removing that compartmentalization that's currently present. So just a quick summary, SDGs design interweaves biosphere, economy and society to produce an integrated set of goals. Unfortunately, the indicator assessment currently compartmentalizes these goals and doesn't really link the biosphere, economy and society. And this disconnect between the goals potentially masks losses in long-term sustainability due to short-term gains that will be lost in the future due to interactions. So the next research project I wanted to talk to you about was a project called Future Seas 2030. And if you're interested in that, there is actually a website now, futureseas2030.org. And this project was inspired by the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science. So the main aim of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science is to boost international coordination and cooperation in research and scientific programs for better management of ocean and coastal zone resources and reducing maritime risks. And if you look at the priority areas and activities that have been drafted for the decade, most of these priority areas revolve around getting more data. And that's obviously great, but getting more data doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have the decisions, actions, and impact that could potentially come out of that data. So we're not currently using all the data we have, and collecting more data isn't necessarily going to give us any change in impact in the future. So what we were interested in doing was looking at what the future could look like if we use the knowledge that we already have and the data and technology. And perhaps more importantly, if we could come up with a narrative of what the future could look like, how could we actually get to that future? So what was the pathway towards that future? And this led to the development of a program called Future Seas, which involves about over 100 researchers, mostly based in Tasmania at CSIRO and UTAS. But there are also people in various other places, including a group of 12 Indigenous and traditional knowledge holders from around the world who are providing their perspective on this. And what we've done is we've looked at 12 grand challenges for the ocean. And this is going to be a special issue in Reviews in Fish Biology and Fisheries coming out later in the year, where each of the papers looks at a different grand challenge for the ocean. And I'm going to talk through an example of that in a minute. But just to give you an idea of what our approach was, we were interested in coming up with these alternate futures. So the first was a business as usual. So this is the future where we're currently heading if nothing changes. And I definitely would like to emphasize that this was pre-COVID-19. And so we acknowledge that this is more about going back to business as usual rather than necessarily carrying on from where we are at this very second. And then the alternate future was a technically possible sustainable future that we could achieve if we use the knowledge and technology we already have available or that's already being developed. And the more sustainable future was using the SDGs as a guide, so heading in that direction. And the idea was to come up with futures that were plausible, evidence-informed, and defensible. And the difference between these two futures is based on human choices, behavior, management, political will, and so on. And by looking at that, we could come up with pathways to achieve this more sustainable future with specific actions that would be needed to go from the business as usual to the sustainable future. So what we did is, this was a 3-step process, and the workshops have been run over about 1.5 years. The first was very much about building the interdisciplinary team. and identifying the problem. So we identified these 12 key challenges, what we thought counted as more sustainable. So that, as I said, it was in line with the SDGs. We went through potential methods to come up with the scenarios, the alternate futures, and identified some underlying assumptions that we thought crossed across all of the key challenges. The next step, each of the challenges went away and identified drivers that would impact on the path of the future to 2030. So what were the factors that would differentiate between a business as usual versus a more sustainable 2030? We then developed a series of scenarios or alternate futures, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. And then we created the pathways. So this is a series of actions that could be put in place that would help us achieve this more sustainable future. And then the final step in the program has been to identify common themes and interdisciplinary learning across the groups. And I really would like to emphasize that this was a very interdisciplinary endeavor. Although the leadership team are all marine ecologists, we have been working with people from a wide range of disciplines. And I've just highlighted here that there are people working from human health, psychology, ICT, the arts, and so on. And that's been really great because it's given us the ability to really come up with some exciting solutions, but it also has been an exercise in patience and listening, and I cannot emphasize that enough. So for example, as I said, we came up with our 12 key challenges. In the leadership team, we came up with our 12 key challenges, and then we went to the first workshop and spent the whole first workshop being told that the other disciplines didn't necessarily agree with our key challenges. And that was something that we hadn't even really considered was something we needed to discuss. So it really has been a lesson in listening. So how we came up with the futures, the scenarios. First of all, we brainstormed drivers of change, and the examples I've got here in the grey text are from the key challenge I'm going to go through in a second. So you don't necessarily need to read the examples, it's just to give you an idea of what's included. So first of all, we brainstormed these drivers of change. So these are things that could impact on the direction of the future. And because we came up with a lot of drivers, we then had to collate them into more umbrella groupings. So for example, an umbrella grouping in the challenge I'm going to talk about was lifestyle and connectedness to the oceans. Then what we did is we mapped these drivers onto influence and impact axes. So we have axes that are from low to high influence, so that we have low ability to influence that driver, or we have high ability to influence that driver, through to drivers that will have a low impact on the future versus drivers that will have a high impact on the future. And we were really interested in those drivers that fell in the top right-hand corner, the ones that have a high impact on our key challenge, but also we have a high ability to influence. And for those of you who've done scenario development yourselves, this is slightly different to what you might have done, where you might have focused on uncertainty and you wanted the ones, you've looked at drivers that have a great deal of uncertainty to give you the biggest range of possible futures. Because we were really interested in what was technically possible that we could imagine with our current knowledge, we were interested in ones that were high impact, high influence. And then for each of these umbrella drivers that we identified as high impact, high influence, we came up with descriptors of what the current status was, what business as usual 2030 might be, and what sustainable 2030 might look like. And from that, we developed narrative scenarios and graphics of each of the futures. So I'm just going to talk through one of the challenges key challenges we did, oceans and society, feedbacks between ocean health and human health. And just to clarify what I mean by human health, this is a very holistic definition that we used. It covers physical health, mental health, cultural, community resilience, and so on. So it's a very, very broad definition. And what we were interested in was looking at the potentially undesirable impacts of the ocean on humans, and the more desirable ones. So undesirable ones such as natural disasters, through to desirable ones such as the positive impact of well-being that healthy oceans can have on human health. And same, the impacts that humans could have on the oceans from externalities from industry as undesirable, through to desirable ones such as integrated management and ocean stewardship. And really the key challenge we were interested in was to minimize these undesirable interactions and to maximize these desirable ones. How could we do that to 2030 to improve both ocean and human health? So the drivers of change that we looked at that could potentially create a more sustainable future and produce more desirable feedbacks between ocean health and human health was decision-making context and behavior change initiatives. So this is to do with people's worldview and how decision makers support behavior change within communities and individuals, power and agency, human development and industry, the food system both on land and sea, and lifestyle and connectedness to the oceans. And I'm just going to talk through the two futures with a few examples. There's obviously a lot more detail in the actual paper, but just to give you a kind of a flavour of the differences between the alternate futures. So on the top left here we have our less sustainable future, or our business as usual future, and then the main picture is our more sustainable future. And if we talk about behaviour change initiatives, in the business as usual future, particularly in human health, a lot of the focus at the moment is on the individual and encouraging the individual to make healthy choices. And that tends to have very unequal outcomes because those who are incapable of making those changes based on fear and feeling like they need to do the right thing are often stigmatized, and that can lead to further inequalities. In contrast, in our more sustainable future, public health initiatives are very much focused on the community and developing a sense of community and driving more equitable outcomes. Then if we look at connection to the oceans, in our business as usual, connection to the oceans is pretty weak, and there's a lot of design and technological barriers to that connection. And in contrast, in our more sustainable future, there's a very strong connection to the oceans and design and technological enablers. And just to give you a quick example of that, currently people who are recovering from breast cancer surgery, a standard treatment plan is to give people exercises they need to do to recover from their surgery, and then people will be phoned up at regular intervals to see how they're doing. So it's a very sort of isolated, you need to be able to motivate yourself and you're going to do these exercises on your own. But there's an increasing number of programs that are getting breast cancer survivors who've had these operations to join fly fishing clubs. And the reason is because the exercises that you have to do when you are recovering from breast cancer surgery is very similar to the movement you make when you cast a fly, when you go fly fishing. And it's found that not only have these initiatives been useful as far as the recovery from the surgery, they're also building a sense of community, they're building attachment to location, and they are providing people with whole new experiences that have been having positive impacts on well-being. And then the final example I wanted to give you was to do with the human development and industry driver. So the business as usual will be very much focused on growth and the linear economy, whereas a more sustainable future will be looking at a more balanced and circular economy. And to give you an example of this, currently about 1.5 billion tons of steel are produced each year, and that steel requires about 800 million tons of coal in the coking process, which obviously has implications for both ocean and human health. In our more sustainable future, environmental engineering is really encouraged. An example of that would be green steel, which actually uses discarded tires rather than coal in the coking process. So it's initiatives like this to create a more circular economy. So I've talked about what the futures might look like, but it's also important to think about how we might get to those. And we came up with 4 key strategies to achieve our more sustainable future. The first is very much focused on science and health communication. So this is more sort of one-way communication, traditional learning and so on. The second is knowledge exchange. Learning and sharing information, building networks, so on. The third is incentives. A lot of those were economic incentives. And the final was rules and regulations. And I'm not going to go through, we had like 80 different actions that could be split into these 4 strategies. And I'm not going to go through them, but I'll just give you a key sort of assumption that was underlying our pathway. And that was that we needed to build marine citizenship and a more equitable distribution of power and agency in order to make these sustainable changes at individual, community, industry and policy levels. And so building marine citizenship was a really key first step that we would need to take at the beginning of the ocean decade in order to be able to achieve this more sustainable future by 2030. So just a summary of the Future Seas programme. To meet the grand challenges that face the ocean, we need to use the data that we already have. Finding solutions will really be an interdisciplinary endeavour. We can't do this work in isolation. It's not about conserving the marine environment or working in marine ecology. We need to actually engage with other disciplines and learn from those other disciplines. Particularly ICT, psychology, public health, and things like that are really important to identify what are the leverage points we can use to change people's behaviour and move towards a more sustainable future. And so, as I said at the beginning, one of the key things about the Ocean Decade is they were looking at the science we need for the ocean we want. And Future Seas is really about imagining the ocean we need for the future we want. So those are the 2 of the big research projects that I've done while I've been at CMS. I did now just want to pick up 3 or 4 of the lessons that I've learnt through this whole process to do with interdisciplinary research. As I said, I've progressed towards this more sustainability and human health focus. So this infographic is from a paper that we put out last year, which looks at 10 tips for developing interdisciplinary researchers. And you don't need to read them all. I'm just going to focus on 4 of these key lessons. So the first, the top here is developing an area of expertise. And as I said at the beginning, I've very much focused on maintaining my functional ecology background in my contributions to all this interdisciplinary research. And I think it's been a really useful thing because it helps you provide an area of expertise in amongst the all the questions you're going to have to ask about things that you know nothing about. So it gives you a sort of solid grounding to come back to when you're working in an interdisciplinary approach. The next one is to be patient. I was very naive with the Future Seas project with how long it would take just to build the relationships necessary to begin the research program. There is definitely a transaction cost to doing interdisciplinary research, and I think it's important not to underestimate what that transaction cost is. Not to say that it's not worth it, because it definitely is, because you can ask questions that I certainly would never have been able to ask if I was working on isolation or just with other marine ecologists. The next is to push your boundaries and to get out of your comfort zone. Standing up and talking about examples to do with public health and breast cancer surgery is definitely outside my comfort zone, but I think it's a really good way of opening yourself up to new ideas and perspectives, and also to grow and learn in new directions. So pushing your boundaries is definitely on the cards if you're doing interdisciplinary work. And then the last one is about collaborating widely. The other thing with this Future Seas project is it's been very useful for me to learn, to meet people throughout the University of Tasmania and CSIRO in Tasmania, because it's required me to, as I said earlier, work with people from public health, people from law, people from psychology, and so on. So it's a really actually exciting way of collaborating with other disciplines and meeting new people. Now, before I finish, I just wanted to mention a bit about academic life, and I know that Georgie introduced it nicely at the beginning. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I developed a website called Academic Life, which has a whole load of resources to help parents and carers navigate working in academia or research and their home life. And this is just a screenshot of the website, and it's got a whole load of resources from how to return to work after your parental leave, through to where to get funding if you need childcare to go to a conference. And I've also added some new resources as a result of COVID-19. There's a page for HDR students on where you can get data if you can't do your field work because you're isolated at home, and how to move to a more of a desktop approach. So it's not just for people who have kids, it's whether you have family, elderly relatives or whatever you need to care for. And in the current situation, balancing being a HDR student with the realities of COVID-19. There is also a whole page of activities for families who are stuck at home, homeschooling their children. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Kirsty. Such an interesting interdisciplinary talk in many facets. It's been really interesting to see how you developed your program over time, and I'm sure everyone is applauding silently. We're going to allow everyone to unmute themselves if they want any questions. But I was just interested if you had any more insights beyond kind of those few little tidbits you gave us at the end about what you think has led to a successful interdisciplinary research program that you're building. Is there anything outside of those 4 points that you kind of highlighted that you've found to be integral for your success in moving outside of functional ecology and into the sustainable science?
I would say one of the key things is being in an environment where you can make mistakes and no one is going to make you feel stupid for it. Centre for Marine Socioecology is very focused on developing interdisciplinary scientists, not just doing interdisciplinary science. And so as a result, there's lots of opportunities to engage with other disciplines and learn and ask what things that are probably stupid questions, but never be made to feel that you're being stupid. And so it creates an atmosphere where you can learn and you don't have to hide the things that you are ignorant about. So I would say that finding a group or a mentor that is very encouraging and open to you learning to do interdisciplinary research is something that can make a massive difference. Okay,
perfect. And patience. It sounds like it's taken a few years to drive these things to the finishing line. So I'm sure it's yes. A massive effort. Everyone, you should be able to unmute yourselves now. If you have any other questions, we'll open it up to anyone else.
Hi, Kirsty. Thanks very much for the really interesting talk. I just had a question slightly off topic, and I was just wondering if you have any insights into how much the Sustainable Development Goals and People's Progress countries' progress in achieving those goals actually motivates countries' actions, be their social development or environmental policy. Like whether countries are seeing that they're making progress in regards to eliminating poverty according to the metrics that are commonly used to measure the sustainable development goals, whether they are actually catalysts or important driver of different countries' social and environmental policy. I know it's slightly out the scope of your research, but I was just wondering if you had a sense of that.
My sort of sense is that it's really variable, and that there are some countries that are very engaged and are very motivated and are focused on these assessments, and some are going through the motions. But that's, you know, based on purely sort of you know, anecdotal evidence that I certainly haven't looked at that in any detail, but I do get the impression from looking at, you know, you look at Sweden, for example, that seems to be very on it, whereas other countries not so much, and maybe the SDGs and understanding their interactions is a chore that needs to be endured.
Yeah, thanks.